There's no pain quite like burying your own child. Thomas Raye knows this truth as he rides into Willow Ridge with empty hands and a shattered heart. The 58-year-old cowboy has just lost his only son in a ranch accident. Now he's got nowhere to go and no reason to keep going. The townfolk see a stranger and keep walking. But Miss Ada Ellison, the schoolteacher, sees something different. She's a widow who knows what grief looks like. When she walks up to him that first evening and offers simple kindness, neither one knows what's about to happen. Sometimes healing comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, two broken people can help each other find their way back to living. Can a grieving cowboy and a lonely teacher discover that it's never too late for a second chance at happiness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hung low over Willow Ridge, like a tired old man settling into his favorite chair, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Thomas Raye's horse limped into town with the same weary gait as its rider, both of them carrying the weight of too many miles and too much sorrow. The animal's left front hoof favored the ground, and Thomas knew they wouldn't be traveling any farther today, maybe not for several days. He'd ridden through countless towns just like this one over the past 2 weeks, each one blurring into the next, like watercolors in the rain. False-fronted buildings lined both sides of the street. Miller's General Store with its hand-painted sign, the Willow Ridge Bank with bars on the windows, Murphy's medical practice squeezed between a barber shop and what looked like a small restaurant. People moved about their evening routines, women calling children in for supper, men finishing up at the livery stable, an elderly couple rocking on their porch and nodding to neighbors passing by. It was the kind of town Thomas had avoided most of his adult life, the kind of place where folks knew each other's business and strangers drew curious stares. But his horse needed tending, and frankly, Thomas wasn't sure he had the strength to care about curious stares anymore. He guided his mount toward the livery stable, where a thick-set man in a leather apron looked up from shoeing a bay mare. The blacksmith's hands were steady and sure, the kind of hands that spoke of decades spent working with animals and metal and fire. "Evening," the man called out, setting down his hammer. "Name's Ben Crawford. You looking for a place to stable your horse?" Thomas Raye. He dismounted slowly, his joints protesting after hours in the saddle. "Horse went lame about 5 miles back, hoping you might take a look." Crawford walked around the animal with practiced eyes, lifting the injured hoof and examining it carefully. "Stone bruise, looks like. Nothing too serious, but she'll need a few days' rest. Maybe a week to be safe." Thomas nodded, pulling a few coins from his vest pocket, nearly all the money he had left. "What's that going to cost me?" $2 for the week, including feed." Crawford's voice was matter-of-fact, neither friendly nor unfriendly. "There's a boarding house down the street if you need a place to stay. Mrs. Peterson runs it. Clean beds, decent food." "Much obliged." As Thomas shouldered his saddlebags and bedroll, he caught sight of a woman across the street watering a small garden beside a neat white house. She was perhaps 45, with graying brown hair pinned back in a simple style, and a blue dress that had seen better days but was clean and well-mended. Something about the way she moved, deliberate, gentle, without hurry, made him pause. She looked up as if sensing his gaze, and their eyes met for just a moment. Thomas touched the brim of his hat out of habit, and she nodded in return before looking away. There had been something in her expression, not curiosity like the others he'd noticed watching him, but something deeper, recognition, maybe, though they'd never met. The boarding house was exactly what he'd expected. A 2-story building with a wide front porch and lace curtains in the windows. Mrs. Peterson turned out to be a thin woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes and a businesslike manner. "One night?" she asked, looking him up and down. "Maybe more, depends on my horse. $1.50 a night, includes breakfast. Supper's extra if you want it." She handed him a key attached to a wooden block, with the number 3 carved into it. "Rooms upstairs, second door on the right. No drinking, no gambling, no women." Thomas almost smiled at that last rule. "Yes, ma'am." His room was small but clean, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a chipped basin, and a single window that looked out over the main street. He set his belongings on the bed and sank into the room's only chair, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the day's ride. From his saddlebag, he pulled out a worn silver locket, the only photograph he had of his son, Jacob. The boy's face looked back at him, serious and proud in his Sunday clothes, taken just 2 years ago when Jacob turned 22. Thomas had been so proud that day, watching his son grow into a fine young man who could handle any horse, fix any fence, and read the weather better than men twice his age. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Jacob lying still in the dirt, his neck bent at an impossible angle, the spooked mare still snorting and dancing nearby. Thomas had held his boy until the warmth left his body, had dug the grave with his own hands because he couldn't bear to let anyone else do it. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He quickly closed the locket and called out, "Come in." Mrs. Peterson poked her head inside. "There's a lady downstairs asking after you. Says she wanted to welcome you to town proper-like." Thomas frowned. He hadn't spoken to anyone except Crawford and Mrs. Peterson. "What lady?" "Miss Ellison, the schoolteacher. The woman from across the street." Thomas ran a hand over his stubbled face, wondering what a schoolteacher could want with a drifter like him. "Tell her I'll be right down." He found her waiting in the boarding house's small parlor, her hands folded in her lap. Up close, he could see the kindness in her brown eyes, but also something else's shadow that spoke of her own acquaintance with loss. "Mr. Raye, I'm Ada Ellison." Her voice was soft but clear, with the kind of authority that came from years of managing classrooms full of children. "I hope you don't think me forward for calling on you like this." "Not at all, ma'am." Thomas remained standing, hat in hand. "Though I can't imagine what business a schoolteacher might have with me." "No business, really. I just saw you earlier and thought you looked like a man who might appreciate a home-cooked meal." She smiled, and Thomas realized it had been weeks since anyone had smiled at him with genuine warmth. "I've got a pot of stew on the stove and more biscuits than one person can eat. Would you care to join me?" Thomas hesitated. He'd gotten used to his own company these past weeks, used to the silence and the solitude of grief. But something in Ada Ellison's manner, lack of pity in her eyes, the simple human kindness of the offer, made him nod. "That's very generous of you, Miss Ellison. I'd be honored." Her house was as neat and comfortable as he'd expected. Polished wooden floors covered with braided rugs, shelves lined with books, and a kitchen that smelled of herbs and fresh bread. The table was already set for 2, as if she'd been certain he would accept. "Please, sit anywhere you like." Ada ladled thick beef stew into bowls, while Thomas took in his surroundings. Everything spoke of a woman who took care with details, the carefully tended garden, visible through the kitchen window, the pressed tablecloth, the way the salt and pepper shakers sat just so beside a small vase of wildflowers. "This is very kind of you," Thomas said as she placed a bowl before him. "I hope I haven't put you to any trouble." "No trouble at all. I don't often have company for supper." Ada took her seat across from him, and Thomas noticed the pale band of skin on her ring finger, where a wedding band had once rested. "Are you traveling through, or might you be staying in Willow Ridge for a while?" "Depends on my horse. She picked up a stone bruise and needs rest." Thomas tasted the stew and couldn't suppress a small sound of appreciation. "This is wonderful, Miss Ellison. Been a long time since I've had a meal this good." "Thank you, and please call me Ada." She studied his face with the quiet attention of someone accustomed to reading people. "Have you been traveling long?" Something in her tone, not prying, but gently interested, made Thomas find himself answering more honestly than he'd intended. "A couple of weeks now." "Since—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Ada nodded as if she understood perfectly. "Grief has its own schedule, doesn't it? Can't be hurried, can't be reasoned with." Thomas looked up sharply, meeting her eyes. "You speak like someone who knows." "My husband passed 3 years ago, come October. Samuel Ellison worked at the bank." Ada's voice remained steady, but Thomas caught the slight tightening around her eyes that spoke of pain carefully managed. Pneumonia took him that first hard winter after we moved here. Fast and cruel, the way these things sometimes are. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling with empty words. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky, and Thomas could hear the sounds of a town settling into evening. A dog barking somewhere, children's voices calling good night, the distant sound of someone playing a harmonica. "Did you have children?" Thomas asked, then immediately regretted the question when he saw the brief flash of pain cross Ada's features. "We hope to," she said simply. "It wasn't to be." She straightened her shoulders with the kind of practiced dignity that comes from years of answering that question. "But I have my students, 23 of them this year, ages 6 to 14. They keep me busy enough." Thomas found himself wondering about this woman who had opened her home to a stranger, who spoke of loss without bitterness and found purpose in other people's children. There was a strength in her that wasn't hard or brittle, but deep and enduring like the roots of an old tree. "What about you?" Ada asked gently. "Do you have family?" The question hit him like a physical blow, and Thomas set down his spoon with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Had a son," he managed. "Jacob. He was everything good I ever did in this world." Ada didn't offer empty platitudes or meaningless comfort. She simply reached across the table and briefly touched his hand, her fingers warm and calloused from years of washing chalkboards and tending gardens. "I'm sorry," she said, and the simple words carried more weight than all the elaborate condolences he'd heard from well-meaning strangers. When the meal was finished, Ada walked him to the door. The night air was cool and crisp, full of the promise of autumn. "Thank you," Thomas said, settling his hat on his head. "For the meal and for—" He struggled to find words for what she had given him. A moment of human connection, a brief respite from the crushing weight of his sorrow. "You're welcome to come by tomorrow evening if you'd like," Ada said. "I usually sit on the porch after supper, watch the stars come out. It's peaceful." Thomas touched the brim of his hat. "I'd like that, Miss Ada. I'd like that very much." As he walked back toward the boarding house, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks, the faintest stirring of hope. Not for happiness that seemed impossible, but for the possibility that he might somehow learn to carry his grief without it destroying him completely. Behind him, Ada Ellison stood in her doorway watching until he disappeared into the boarding house, her hand unconsciously touching the chain around her neck, where her wedding ring hung hidden beneath her dresser. Reminder of love lost, but also of love's enduring power to heal. Thomas woke before dawn, as was his habit after 30 years of ranch work. The unfamiliar sounds of the town filtered through his window, a rooster crowing somewhere nearby, the clatter of a milk wagon on cobblestones, the distant whistle of the morning train. For a moment, he'd forgotten where he was, expecting to see the canvas walls of his bedroll under the stars. The reality settled over him like a familiar weight. Jacob was gone, and Thomas was adrift in a town where he didn't belong. He dressed quietly and made his way downstairs, where Mrs. Peterson was already bustling about the kitchen, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the air. "Morning," she said briskly, setting a plate before him without ceremony. "Sleep well?" "Well enough, thank you." After breakfast, Thomas walked to the livery stable to check on his horse. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and he could see his breath in small puffs as he walked. Crawford was already at work, the steady ring of his hammer against anvil providing a rhythmic soundtrack to the awakening town. "How's she looking?" Thomas asked, running his hand along his mare's neck. Crawford straightened, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool morning. "Better than yesterday, but she's still favoring that hoof. I'd give her another day or two before you think about moving on." Thomas nodded, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to move on at all. The prospect of more empty miles, more anonymous towns, more nights alone with his grief felt overwhelming in the morning light. "I appreciate you taking care of her," he said, pulling a coin from his pocket to pay for another day's board. "No trouble. She's a good horse, just needs time to heal." Time to heal. The words echoed in Thomas's mind as he walked back toward the boarding house. How much time did healing take? How did a man learn to live with a hole in his chest where his heart used to be? He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice Ada approaching until she called his name softly. "Mr. Raye? Thomas?" He looked up to find her standing near the boarding house steps, a small basket in her hands and concern in her brown eyes. "Miss Ada, you're out early." "I was taking some preserves to Mrs. Henderson. She's been poorly lately." Ada studied his face with the same gentle attention she'd shown the night before. "You look like a man who could use some coffee and a friendly ear." Thomas almost declined out of habit. He'd grown used to solitude, to working through his pain alone. But something about Ada's presence made the morning feel less empty, less hopeless. "I wouldn't want to impose." "You wouldn't be. Come on, I'll put a fresh pot on." They walked to her house in comfortable silence, the morning sun casting long shadows across her well-tended garden. Ada moved with quiet efficiency, grinding coffee beans and setting the pot to boil, while Thomas stood awkwardly in her kitchen, unsure of his place in this domestic scene. "Sit, please," Ada said, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "You're making me nervous hovering there like you're planning to bolt." Despite himself, Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile he'd managed in weeks. "Sorry. I'm not used to—" He gestured vaguely at the cozy kitchen, the morning light streaming through clean windows, the simple normalcy of it all. "Kindness," Ada suggested gently, and Thomas felt something twist in his chest at the accuracy of her observation. "I was going to say civilization, but I suppose that amounts to the same thing." Ada poured coffee into 2 thick ceramic mugs and joined him at the table. For a few minutes, they sat in companionable silence, the steam from their cups creating small clouds in the cool morning air. "Tell me about your horse," Ada said eventually. "She's beautiful. What's her name?" "Belle. Had her for 6 years now. She's carried me through more country than I can count." Thomas wrapped his hands around the warm mug, grateful for something to do with them. "She was Jacob's favorite. He always said she had more sense than most people he knew." "Jacob was your son." It wasn't a question, and Thomas appreciated that Ada didn't make him explain what she'd already pieced together from his pain. 24 years old. Would have been 25 come Christmas. Thomas's voice caught slightly, but he pressed on. "He was everything I wasn't: steady, reliable, good with people. Had plans to buy a little spread of his own, maybe find a nice girl to marry." Ada waited, her presence a gentle invitation to continue if he chose to. "We were moving a herd of cattle from summer pasture," Thomas found himself saying. "Nothing unusual about it. We'd done it 100 times before. But something spooked the cattle, and they started to run. Jacob was trying to turn them when his horse stepped in a prairie dog hole." The words came easier now, as if the simple act of speaking them aloud to someone who listened without judgment had loosened something inside him. "Threw him hard, broke his neck." Thomas stared into his coffee, seeing not the dark liquid but Jacob's still form in the dust, the way the light had faded from his eyes. "He died in my arms before I could even get him back to town." Ada's hand found his across the table, her touch warm and steady. "I'm so sorry, Thomas." They sat like that for a long moment, connected by touch and shared understanding of loss. Finally, Thomas gently pulled his hand away and reached for his saddlebags, which he'd brought in from habit. "I keep meaning to go through his things," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Haven't had the heart to—" The leather bag slipped from his fingers, spilling its contents across Ada's kitchen floor. Spare clothes, a few tools, a wooden comband there, among the scattered belongings, a pair of worn leather work gloves that still held the shape of Jacob's hands. The sight of them broke something loose inside Thomas that he'd been holding back for weeks. A sound escaped him, part sob, part moanand. Suddenly he was on his knees among the scattered belongings, the gloves clutched to his chest as 24 years of memories crashed over him like a flood. Jacob, at 2 years old, riding on Thomas's shoulders and laughing at the world spread out below them. Jacob at 10, serious and determined as he learned to rope a calf. Jacob at 20, tall and strong and full of plans for the future. Jacob at 24, still and silent in the dirt, while his father wept over his broken body. Ada knelt beside him without a word, her arms coming around his shaking shoulders as he finally let himself grieve not just for Jacob's death, but for all the things they'd never do together, all the conversations they'd never have, all the grandchildren Thomas would never know. "I failed him," Thomas choked out against Ada's shoulder. "I was supposed to protect him, supposed to keep him safe, and I failed." "No," Ada said firmly, her voice cutting through his anguish. "No, you didn't fail him. You loved him. You raised him to be a good man. That's not failure, that's the greatest success a father can have." She held him while he cried, this woman who barely knew him but understood his pain in ways that cut straight to the heart of it. She didn't offer empty platitudes or try to minimize his loss. She simply sat with him in his grief, lending her strength when his own had finally given out. When the storm passed, Thomas found himself sitting on Ada's kitchen floor, surrounded by the scattered remnants of his life, with Jacob's gloves still clutched in his hands. He felt empty but also somehow lighter, as if the tears had washed away some of the poison that had been building in his system. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to." "Don't apologize for grieving your son," Ada said gently. "Grief isn't something to be ashamed of. It's love with nowhere to go." Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw something in her eyes that made him realize she wasn't just offering comfort, she was sharing it. Her own loss, her own understanding of what it meant to have love with nowhere to go. "How do you bear it?" he asked. "How do you get up every morning and keep going when everything good is gone?" Ada was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer with the care of someone who knew the weight of such questions. "You don't bear it," she said finally. "You carry it. There's a difference. Bearing something implies it's a burden you'll eventually put down. But grief, real grief, becomes part of you. You learn to carry it with grace, to let it make you kinder instead of bitter, to honor what you've lost by living fully in spite of the pain." Thomas felt something shift inside him at her, words not healing, not yet, but the first recognition that healing might someday be possible. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted. Ada smiled, the expression both sad and hopeful. "You don't have to know how. You just have to be willing to try, and you don't have to do it alone." As Thomas carefully repacked his belongings, folding Jacob's gloves with reverent care, he found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, he'd stumbled into Willow Ridge for a reason that had nothing to do with his horse's injured hoof. Ada's barn was small but sturdy, built of weathered wood that had aged to a soft silver gray. It housed her milk cow, a handful of chickens, and now Thomas, who had fashioned himself a simple living space in the empty stall at the far end. He'd strung up a canvas tarp for privacy and arranged his bedroll on a pile of fresh straw. It wasn't much, but it was more comfortable than many places he'd slept over the years. The arrangement had come about naturally, born from Ada's practical kindness and Thomas's need for something to do with his hands. After his breakdown in her kitchen 3 days ago, she'd mentioned that her barn door had been sticking and her chicken coop needed mending. Thomas had offered to take a look, and somehow that had led to him moving his few belongings from the boarding house to her property. "It's not charity," Ada had insisted when he'd protested. "It's fair trade. You fix what needs fixing, and I provide a roof over your head. Besides, Mrs. Peterson's cooking will kill you if you stay there much longer." The comment had surprised a laugh out of him, another small miracle in a life that had seemed devoid of humor just days before. Now, as the first pale light of dawn crept through the barn's small window, Thomas lay listening to the gentle sounds of the animals stirring. The milk cow, a placid Jersey named Buttercup, lowed softly in her stall. The chickens made their quiet morning murmurs as they settled into the routine of another day. It was peaceful in a way Thomas hadn't experienced in years of sleeping under the open sky with one ear always tuned for trouble. He rose and dressed quietly, then made his way to the house where Ada would be starting her morning routine. They'd fallen into an easy pattern over the past few days, coffee together on the porch as the sun came up, quiet conversation that touched on everything and nothing, the comfortable silence of two people learning to trust each other's company. Ada was already at the stove when he tapped softly on the kitchen door, her hair neatly pinned and her blue dress crisp despite the early hour. She looked up with a smile that seemed to come more easily each day. "Morning, Thomas. Coffee's almost ready." "Morning, Miss Ada." He settled into what had become his chair at the kitchen table, noting the way the morning light caught the silver threads in her hair. "Sleep well?" "Like a baby. You?" "Better than I have in months." It was true. Something about the security of four walls and the knowledge that he wasn't entirely alone in the world had allowed him to rest more deeply than he'd thought possible. Ada poured coffee for both of them, the familiar ritual as comforting as the drink itself. Through the kitchen window, Thomas could see the garden where she'd been working yesterday evening, pulling the last of the summer vegetables before the first hard frost claimed them. "I was thinking," Ada said, settling across from him with her own cup, "about that loose board on the schoolhouse steps. If you're not too busy today, would you mind taking a look at it? I'm afraid one of the children will catch their foot and take a tumble." "Be happy to." Thomas sipped his coffee, savoring the rich flavor and the simple pleasure of sharing the morning with someone who cared whether he lived or died. "Anything else need attention while I'm there?" The windows on the south side stick something fierce. Hard to get fresh air when the weather's nice. Ada's tone was casual, but Thomas caught the way she glanced at him sideways, as if gauging his reaction to the suggestion. He understood what she was doing, finding reasons to keep him busy, to give him purpose beyond simply existing from one day to the next. Part of him wanted to bristle at the charity of it, but a larger part was grateful for the lifeline she was throwing him. "I'll bring my tools," he said simply. After breakfast, Thomas walked through town toward the schoolhouse, his leather tool roll tucked under his arm. Willow Ridge was coming to life around him, shopkeepers sweeping their front steps, children hurrying to school with lunch pails swinging from their hands, women hanging wash on lines, strung between buildings. He nodded to the people he passed, receiving polite acknowledgments in return. Word had gotten around, as it did in small towns, that the stranger was staying at Miss Ellison's place and helping with repairs. The arrangement raised eyebrows: an unmarried woman and a drifter sharing property. Even with him sleeping in the barn butt, Ada's reputation for propriety seemed to protect them both from the worst of the gossip. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple white building with a bell tower and a small yard where children played during recess. Thomas could hear Ada's voice through the open windows as he approached, patient and clear, as she worked through arithmetic problems with her students. He examined the loose step first, noting that several of the supporting boards had worked themselves free over time. It was an easy fix, a matter of resetting the boards and adding a few extra nails to hold them secure. As he worked, he found himself listening to the rhythm of the classroom. Ada's questions, the children's eager responses, the scratch of chalk on slate boards. 23, take away 15, Ada was saying. "Who can tell me the answer?" A chorus of young voices called out, 8, with varying degrees of confidence. "Very good. Now, if Mrs. Miller has 23 apples and she sells 15 at the market, how many does she have left to make pies for her family?" Thomas smiled at the way Ada connected abstract numbers to real-world problems the children could understand. It spoke to a gift for teaching that went beyond simply knowing the material. She understood how young minds worked, how to make learning feel relevant and achievable. As he moved on to the stubborn windows, Thomas found himself remembering Jacob at school age, struggling with his letters while other children seemed to learn effortlessly. Thomas had done his best to help, but his own education had been limited, and there had been no patient teacher like Ada to guide his son through the difficult patches. The memory brought the familiar pang of loss, but somehow it felt different, now less sharp, more like an old wound that had finally begun to heal around the edges. From his saddlebags that morning, he'd retrieved something he'd been carrying for weeks without looking at. A small wooden horse he'd carved for Jacob when the boy was 7 years old. Thomas had found it among his son's belongings after the funeral, carefully wrapped in cloth and tucked away like a treasured keepsake. Now, as he worked to free the stuck window sash, Thomas pulled the little horse from his pocket and set it on the windowsill. It was simple work, but skillfully done, the kind of toy a father makes for his child with love and patience during long winter evenings. Jacob had carried it everywhere for months, galloping it across fence posts and hay bales, creating elaborate adventures for his wooden companion. "That's beautiful work." Thomas looked up to find Ada standing in the schoolhouse doorway, having dismissed her students for their noon recess. She approached the window where he was working and picked up the wooden horse with gentle hands. "You made this?" "Long time ago, for Jacob when he was small." Thomas set down his tools and wiped his hands on his pants. "Found it among his things afterward. He'd kept it all these years." Ada turned the carving over in her hands, her fingertips tracing the smooth lines of the horse's mane and the careful detail of its hooves. He must have treasured it. Children don't usually keep toys this long unless they hold special meaning. He loved horses from the time he could walk. This was the first one that was truly his, even if it was just wood and imagination. The best gifts usually are. Ada handed the horse back to him, her expression thoughtful. Would you mind if I showed it to the children? Some of the older boys have been talking about wanting to learn whittling, and this would be a wonderful example of what's possible with patience and skill." Thomas hesitated. The little horse felt too precious, too connected to Jacob's memory, to share with strangers. But something in Ada's tone, the genuine appreciation for the craftsmanship, the understanding of what it meant to him, made him reconsider. "I suppose that would be all right," he said finally. Ada's smile was radiant. "Thank you. It means a great deal sharing something so personal. The children will understand the honor." As Thomas watched her return to the schoolhouse, the wooden horse cradled carefully in her hands, he felt something he'd thought was lost forever. The pleasure of sharing Jacob's memory with someone who would treat it with the reverence it deserved. For the first time since his son's death, Thomas found himself looking forward to tomorrow. The next morning brought the first real chill of autumn, and Thomas could see his breath as he made his way across Ada's yard to check on the chickens. The birds huddled together in their coop, feathers fluffed against the cold, and he made a mental note to reinforce their shelter before the serious cold set in. Winter was coming, and with it questions he wasn't ready to face. How long could he reasonably stay in Ada's barn? What would he do when the weather turned too harsh for outdoor work? Where would he go when spring came and his horse was fully healed? The questions followed him to the schoolhouse, where he'd promised to help Ada prepare for the colder months ahead. She'd mentioned that several of the desks needed repair, and the windows would need to be sealed against drafts. It was work that could keep him busy for weeks, and Thomas found himself grateful for the distraction. Ada met him at the schoolhouse door with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. "You look troubled this morning." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his cold hands around the warm ceramic. "Just thinking about winter coming on. Time has a way of passing, whether you're ready for it or not." "It does indeed." Ada's tone was carefully neutral, but Thomas caught the way her gaze lingered on his face. "Is there something specific worrying you?" Before Thomas could answer, she led him toward a small shed behind the schoolhouse that he hadn't noticed before. The door stuck when she tried to open it, and Thomas stepped forward to lend his strength to the effort. When it finally gave way, they were greeted by the musty smell of disuse and the sight of tools covered in dust and cobwebs. "These were Samuel's," Ada said quietly, running her fingers along the handle of a well-made hammer. "He was handy with repairs, always puttering around the house, fixing this or that. I haven't had the heart to use them since he passed." Thomas picked up the hammer, feeling the weight of it in his hand. It was a good tool, well-balanced and cared for, the kind of implement a man could rely on for years of honest work. "He took pride in his tools," Thomas observed. "He took pride in everything he did. Even the smallest repair was an opportunity to do something well." Ada's voice held the warmth of fond memory rather than sharp grief. "I keep thinking I should find someone who could use them properly, rather than letting them gather dust." The offer hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Thomas set the hammer down carefully, understanding the weight of what she was suggesting. "Miss Ada, I couldn't." "You could, and you should." Her tone was firm but gentle. "Samuel would have liked you, I think." He would have appreciated the care you take with your work, the way you don't cut corners or rush through a job. These tools deserve to be used by someone who understands their value. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, looking at the neat rows of saws and planes, chisels and measures. He thought of Jacob, who had loved watching his father work with wood, who had dreamed of building a house for his future family with his own hands. "Are you certain?" he asked finally. "It seems like too much." "It's not too much. It's exactly what's needed." Ada picked up a small hand plane, its blade still sharp despite years of neglect. "Besides, I have plans for these tools. The schoolhouse needs more than just quick repairs. The desks are falling apart, and the children deserve better. Winter's coming, and we'll all be spending more time indoors. Seems like the perfect opportunity for a project." As they sorted through Samuel's tools, cleaning and organizing them in the schoolhouse's small supply room, Thomas found himself thinking about the man who had owned them. From Ada's gentle reminiscences, he pieced together a picture of someone steady and kind, a man who had found joy in simple domestic pleasures and taken satisfaction in work well done. "He sounds like a good man," Thomas said as they worked. "He was. Different from you in many ways. Samuel was a town man through and through, never happier than when he was surrounded by neighbors and community, but similar in the ways that matter. Decent. Reliable. The kind of man who keeps his word and treats people fairly." Thomas felt a flush of pride at the comparison, followed immediately by a stab of unworthiness. "I don't know that I deserve such high praise, Miss Ada. I've made my share of mistakes over the years." "Haven't we all?" Ada paused in her cleaning of a chisel to look at him directly. "The measure of a person isn't whether they've made mistakes, Thomas. It's what they do afterward, whether they learn from them, whether they try to do better." Later that morning, as Thomas began his assessment of the classroom furniture, he was interrupted by a commotion in the schoolyard. Through the window, he could see several children gathered around something near the large oak tree that dominated one corner of the property. "Miss Ellison," one of the older boys called urgently. "Come quick." Ada hurried outside, Thomas following close behind. They found the children clustered around a small orange kitten that had somehow become stranded high in the oak's branches. The animal mewed pitifully, too frightened to climb down on its own. "How on earth did it get up there?" Ada murmured, shading her eyes against the sun as she peered up at the trapped kitten. "Probably chasing a bird," said Mary Catherine, one of the older girls. "My mama's cat does that all the time, then gets scared when she realizes how high she is." Thomas studied the tree, noting the sturdy branches and the reasonable height of the kitten's perch. It had been years since he'd climbed a tree, but he'd spent enough of his youth scrambling up after lost calves and runaway horses to remember the basics. "I can get him down," he said, already shrugging out of his jacket. The children watched with fascination as Thomas began his careful ascent, testing each branch before trusting it with his full weight. The kitten mewed more urgently as he approached, but didn't try to climb higher. "Easy there, little fellow," Thomas murmured as he reached for the frightened animal. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The kitten allowed itself to be scooped up with minimal protest, tucking itself against Thomas's chest as he began the careful climb back down. When he reached the ground, he was greeted with enthusiastic applause from the children and a warm smile from Ada. "My hero," she said lightly, but Thomas caught the genuine appreciation in her eyes. As the children dispersed to return to their lessons, several of them lingered to thank Thomas personally. Their easy acceptance of him, their assumption that, of course, Mr. Thomas would help rescue a kitten, touched something deep in his chest that he'd thought was permanently closed off. "Thank you," Ada said quietly as they walked back toward the schoolhouse. "You didn't have to do that." "Couldn't leave the little thing up there to starve," Thomas replied, though they both knew his motivation went deeper than simple animal welfare. "The children adore you already," Ada observed. "You have a natural way with them." Thomas thought of Jacob at that age, full of curiosity and mischief, always ready with questions about how things worked and why the world was the way it was. Perhaps his patience with Ada's students came from missing those conversations, from recognizing in their eager faces the same hunger for knowledge and understanding that had driven his own son. "They're good kids," he said simply. That evening, as they sat on Ada's porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Thomas found himself thinking about the day's events. The tools, the kitten, the children's easy acceptance, all of it seemed to be pointing towards something he wasn't quite ready to name. "Miss Ada," he said finally, "what you said earlier about Samuel and me being similar in the ways that matter. Yes? I hope you're right. I hope I'm the kind of man who deserves the kindness you've shown me." Ada was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the last traces of color fading from the western sky. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but certain. "You are, Thomas. You're exactly that kind of man. The fact that you question whether you deserve kindness is proof that you do." The first snow came early that year, dusting Willow Ridge in a fine layer of white that turned the familiar landscape into something magical. Thomas woke in Ada's barn to find everything transformed: the chicken coop topped with a cap of snow, the garden fence posts wearing white mittens, the mountains in the distance gleaming like polished silver. He'd been living on Ada's property for nearly a month now, and the arrangement had settled into something that felt less like charity and more like partnership. He'd become the unofficial handyman for the schoolhouse and several other buildings in town, his reputation for quality work spreading through the community's informal networks. People nodded to him on the street now, some even stopping to exchange pleasantries about the weather or ask his opinion on repair work. The transformation still surprised him sometimes, show. Quickly he'd gone from being a stranger to being, if not quite accepted, then at least tolerated as part of the community fabric. This morning, Ada met him at the kitchen door with coffee and a concerned expression. "The schoolhouse stove is acting up again," she said without preamble. "Won't draw properly, and the children were shivering by the time I dismissed them yesterday." Thomas nodded, already mentally cataloguing the tools he'd need. The old stove had been giving trouble for weeks, and he'd been patching it along with temporary fixes. But with real winter weather arriving, they'd need a more permanent solution. "I'll take a look after breakfast," he promised, settling into his usual chair. "Might need to clean out the flue pipe, or there could be a crack in the firebox." As they shared their morning meal, Thomas found himself studying Ada's face in the lamplight. Over the weeks of their acquaintance, he'd learned to read the subtle signs of her moods: the way she worried her lower lip when she was troubled, the slight tightening around her eyes when she was holding back something she wanted to say. "What is it?" he asked, gently. "Besides the stove, I mean. Something else is bothering you." Ada set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, a gesture he'd come to recognize as her way of buying time to organize her thoughts. "Mrs. Henderson stopped by yesterday evening," she said finally, "after you'd gone to the barn for the night." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. Mrs. Henderson was the town's self-appointed guardian of moral standards, a woman who seemed to find fault with everything and everyone who didn't conform to her narrow view of propriety. What did she want? To express her concerns about our arrangement. Ada's tone was carefully neutral, but Thomas could hear the edge of anger beneath it. "She feels it's inappropriate for an unmarried woman to have a man living on her property, even in the barn. She's worried about my reputation." Thomas set down his own cup, his hands not entirely steady. He'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it would come eventually, but hoping they'd have more time before the community's judgment caught up with them. "She's not wrong," he said quietly. "I should have thought about what this might mean for you, how it might look to people." "She is wrong," Ada said firmly. "She's wrong about you, wrong about me, and wrong about what's happening here. This is my home, Thomas, and I'll decide who's welcome in it." The fierce protectiveness in her voice surprised him, and Thomas found himself looking at her with new eyes. Ada Ellison might appear gentle and mild-mannered, but there was steel beneath the surface, the kind of strength that came from years of standing in front of classrooms full of children, maintaining order through quiet authority rather than bluster. "What did you tell her?" he asked. "I told her that my personal affairs were none of her business, and that if she had concerns about impropriety, she might consider the impropriety of gossiping about her neighbors." Ada's cheeks were flushed with remembered indignation. I may have been less than perfectly Christian in my response. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Thomas felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I would have liked to see that. I'm not proud of losing my temper, Ada admitted, but I won't stand by and let people impugn your character or mine based on small-minded assumptions. They finished breakfast in thoughtful silence, each lost in their own concerns about what Mrs. Henderson's visit might mean for their future. Thomas knew that once gossip took root in a small town, it had a way of growing like weeds, choking out truth and reason until only innuendo remained. At the schoolhouse, Thomas threw himself into the work of repairing the stove with more intensity than the job strictly required. He cleaned the flue pipe meticulously, sealed every crack in the firebox, and adjusted the dampers until the old stove drew better than it had in years. The physical labor helped quiet the turmoil in his mind, gave him something concrete to focus on while he tried to sort through his feelings. He was tightening the last bolt on the stovepipe when Ada approached with a photograph in her hands, a formal portrait in a silver frame that she usually kept on her desk. I wanted to show you this, she said, settling the frame on the windowsill where the light would catch it properly. Thomas looked at the photograph and saw Ada as she had been perhaps 10 years ago, standing beside a thin man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. They were dressed in their Sunday best, and both wore the slightly stiff expressions common to formal photography, but there was warmth in the way they stood close together, the man's hand resting protectively on Ada's shoulder. "Samuel," Thomas said, "it wasn't a question. On our 5th wedding anniversary, we'd finally saved enough money to have a proper portrait made." Ada's voice held the bittersweet tone of someone who could speak of loss without being overwhelmed by it. "I keep it on my desk usually, but I thought you should see it properly. Should know something about the man whose tools you're using, whose place you've—" She stopped, seeming to search for the right words. "I haven't taken his place," Thomas said quietly. "No one could do that." "No, you haven't taken his place, but you've made a place of your own, haven't you? In this community, in the schoolhouse." She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "In my life." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of feelings he'd been trying to ignore or dismiss as gratitude for Ada's kindness. "Miss Ada, I know it's complicated," she said quickly, as if afraid she'd lose her courage if she didn't speak immediately. "I know we're both carrying grief, both trying to figure out how to keep living when the people we loved most are gone. But Thomas, these past weeks with you here, I feel more like myself than I have since Samuel died, more alive." Thomas stared at the photograph, at Samuel's kind face, and felt a wash of guilt so strong it made him dizzy. What right did he have to find happiness when Jacob was dead? What right did he have to care for this woman when his own son would never have the chance to love and be loved? "Jacob will never get married," he said, the words torn from some deep place of pain. "He'll never hold his own children, never grow old with someone who loves him. How can I even think about finding those things for myself when he can't?" Ada was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but sure. "Because that's what love does, Thomas. Real love, the kind you had for Jacob, the kind I had for Samuel, it doesn't end when someone dies. It keeps going, keeps growing, keeps wanting the best for the people it touched. Jacob loved you. Don't you think he'd want you to be happy? Don't you think he'd want you to have a reason to keep living fully instead of just surviving?" Thomas closed his eyes, trying to imagine what Jacob would say if he could speak now. He remembered his son's laughter, his easy affection, his genuine concern for his father's loneliness during those long winters when it was just the two of them against the world. "He used to worry about me," Thomas admitted, "about what would happen to me when he got married and had his own family. He said I needed to find myself a good woman before I got too old and set in my ways." Ada smiled, the expression both sad and hopeful. "He sounds like he was wise beyond his years." "He was, in ways I never managed to be." Thomas picked up the photograph, studying Samuel's face more carefully. "Tell me about him, about Samuel." If I'm going toif, we're going too. I need to know about the man who loved you first. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing blizzards that lasted for days and temperatures that made the barn feel like an icebox, despite Thomas's best efforts to insulate it. He'd moved his sleeping area closer to the animals for warmth, and Ada had taken to bringing him hot bricks wrapped in cloth to help ward off the worst of the cold. The harsh weather had an unexpected benefit. It kept the town's gossips indoors, giving Thomas and Ada a respite from curious stares and whispered conversations. But it also forced them into closer proximity, sharing the warmth of Ada's kitchen fire during the long evenings when outdoor work was impossible. It was during one of these evenings, with snow piling against the windows and the wind howling around the eaves, that Thomas found himself carving again for the first time since Jacob's death. His hands seemed to remember the motions without conscious thought, the careful selection of wood, the patient whittling away of everything that wasn't needed, the slow emergence of something beautiful from something ordinary. "What are you making?" Ada asked from her chair by the fire, where she was mending a stack of children's clothing by lamplight. Thomas paused in his work, considering the small figure taking shape in his hands. "An angel, I think, for your Christmas tree." Ada looked up from her sewing, surprise and something deeper flickering across her features. "Thomas, you don't need to." "I want to," he said simply. "It's been too long since I made something just for the joy of it." They worked in comfortable silence after that. The only sounds, the whisper of Thomas's knife against wood and the occasional snap of the fire. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Ada's kitchen, there was peace and warmth and the quiet satisfaction of useful work shared between friends. Or perhaps more than friends. Thomas was still reluctant to name what was growing between them, but he could no longer deny its existence. The way Ada's face lit up when he appeared at her door each morning. The way she saved the best pieces of pie for him, and how she always seemed to have an extra cup of coffee ready just when he needed it most. The way she listened when he talked about Jacob, not with pity but with genuine interest in understanding the boy who had meant everything to his father. And on his side the way, his chest tightened when she smiled, the protective instinct that flared whenever he heard criticism of her in town. The growing certainty that he wanted to spend his remaining years making sure Ada Ellison never felt lonely or unsafe again. "Tell me about Christmas when you were a boy," Ada said suddenly, breaking into his thoughts. Thomas considered the question, his knife moving automatically as he shaped the angel's wings. "We didn't have much in the way of celebrating. Jacob's mother died when he was born, and after that it was just the two of us moving from ranch to ranch. Christmas was mostly just another day, except I'd try to find him something speciala, new book maybe, or carve him a toy if I had time. The wooden horse. Among others, yes, I made him a whistle one year, and a set of toy soldiers another time." Thomas smiled at the memory. He'd lined those soldiers up for hours, planning elaborate battles and adventures, had names for each one of them, complete histories of their imaginary lives. Ada set aside her mending and moved to the window, peering out at the swirling snow. "Samuel and I used to talk about Christmas with children. What traditions we'd start, how we'd make the holiday magical for them. We bought a few ornaments over the years, planning for the family we hope to have. Where are they now? The ornaments? Packed away in the attic. I couldn't bear to use them alone, but I couldn't bear to get rid of them either." Ada turned back to him, her expression thoughtful. "Perhaps this year. Perhaps it's time to bring them down again." The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Thomas helped Ada retrieve her Christmas decorations from the attic, climbing the narrow ladder while she directed him toward the proper boxes. What they found was a treasure trove of carefully preserved ornaments, delicate glass balls in jewel tones, paper angels with hand-painted faces, strings of cranberries and popcorn that had somehow survived the years without crumbling. "Samuel made these," Ada said, lifting out a set of wooden stars painted in bright colors. "He wasn't much of an artist, but he tried so hard to make them beautiful." Thomas examined the stars, noting the careful workmanship despite their creator's modest artistic skills. He loved you very much. He did, and I loved him. Ada's voice was steady, free of the desperate grief that had marked her earlier mentions of her husband. I always will. But love isn't a finite resource, is it? Loving you doesn't diminish what I felt for Samuel, any more than loving Jacob made you incapable of caring for others. The casual way she spoke of loving him made Thomas's hand still on the ornament he was holding. They'd been dancing around the subject for weeks, but hearing her say the words aloud made everything suddenly, terrifyingly real. "Ada, I know it frightens you," she said gently. "It frightens me too. I never expected to feel this way again. Never thought my heart had room for another love after Samuel. But here we are." They decorated the tree together that afternoon, hanging Samuel's painted stars alongside the angel Thomas had carved. The little figure wasn't perfect, the face was slightly asymmetrical, and one wing was marginally larger than the other, but it was unmistakably crafted with love and care. "She's beautiful," Ada said as Thomas positioned the angel at the top of the tree. "What will you call her?" Thomas considered the question, thinking of the hope the small carving represented his first creative act since Jacob's death, his first gesture toward a future that might hold joy as well as sorrow. "Hope," he said finally. "Her name is Hope." That evening, as they sat by the fire admiring their handiwork, Ada reached for Thomas's hand. Her fingers were warm and calloused from years of work, and they fit perfectly between his own. "The children are planning a Christmas pageant," she said. "Nothing elaborate, just songs and recitations, maybe a short play about the Nativity. Would you consider helping? We could use someone to build a simple stage, and the children would love to have you there." Thomas squeezed her hand gently, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. "I'd be honored to help." "Good, because I've already told them you would." Ada's smile was impish, reminding him that beneath her proper schoolteacher demeanor lay a woman with her own brand of mischief. "Presumptuous of you, Miss Ada?" "Perhaps. But I know you, Thomas Raye. I know you won't disappoint those children any more than you'd disappoint me." Later that night, as Thomas settled into his bedroll in the barn, he found himself thinking about Ada's words. She knew him perhaps better than he knew himself these days. She saw past the grief and guilt that had defined him since Jacob's death, saw the man he'd been before tragedy struck, and the man he might become again with time and patience and love. For the first time in months, Thomas allowed himself to imagine a future that extended beyond simple survival. A future where he woke each morning to Ada's smile, where he had a role in the community beyond that of helpful stranger, where he might find purpose and meaning in building something lasting instead of just drifting from place to place. It was a dangerous kind of hope, the kind that made a man vulnerable to loss all over again. But as he listened to the wind whistling around the barn walls and felt the small warmth of possibility growing in his chest, Thomas found he was willing to take that risk. Some things, he was beginning to understand, were worth the chance of heartbreak. The letter arrived on a bitter February morning when the snow lay 3 feet deep and the world seemed locked in winter's grip. Thomas was splitting wood behind Ada's house when he heard the jingle of harness and the crunch of wheels on packed snow. He looked up to see Sheriff Ben Crawford climbing down from his wagon, his face grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Thomas set down his axe, a familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. In his experience, visits from lawmen rarely brought good news, and Crawford's expression suggested this would be no exception. "Morning, Sheriff," Thomas called out, keeping his voice level despite the unease crawling up his spine. "Thomas, is Miss Ellison about? I need to speak with both of you." "She's in the schoolhouse. What's this about?" Crawford pulled a folded telegram from his coat pocket, the yellow paper stark against his gloved fingers. "Better we all discuss it together. This concerns you directly, and Miss Ada deserves to hear it firsthand." They found Ada dismissing her students for their noon recess, her patient voice carrying across the schoolyard as she reminded them to bundle up against the cold. She looked up with a smile as Thomas and Crawford approached, but the expression faded when she saw the sheriff's serious demeanor. "Gentlemen, is everything all right?" Crawford removed his hat, running his fingers through his graying hair. "Miss Ada, I'm afraid I have some troubling news that concerns Thomas here. Perhaps we could speak privately." Ada glanced between the two men, reading the tension in their faces. "Of course. Come inside where it's warm." The schoolhouse felt smaller with the three adults inside, the children's desks and colorful drawings on the walls, creating an incongruous backdrop for whatever serious business had brought Crawford to their door. Thomas remained standing near the stove, while Ada and the sheriff took seats, the folded telegram lying between them like an unexploded bomb. "I received this yesterday from Marshal Jenkins, over in Cedar Falls," Crawford began, unfolding the yellow paper. "There was a bank robbery there 6 weeks ago. Took nearly $1,500 and shot a clerk in the process. Young man still laid up, may never walk right again." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice water. Cedar Falls, she'd been there, remembered it dimly through the haze of grief and whiskey that had marked his first weeks after Jacob's death. He'd stopped there to water his horse and buy supplies, had even considered staying a few days to let his wounds heal in anonymity. "What does this have to do with Thomas?" Ada asked, though her voice carried a note of growing alarm. Crawford looked directly at Thomas, and there was genuine regret in his eyes. "The witness description matches you pretty closely, Thomas. Man about your age and build, riding alone, wearing a brown coat and black hat, left town heading west the same day as the robbery." "That's impossible," Ada said immediately, her voice sharp with indignation. "Thomas would never." "I know what you think of him, Miss Ada, and I respect your judgment, but I've got a legal duty to investigate." Crawford's tone was apologetic but firm. "Thomas, I need to ask you some questions about where you were on January 15th. Thomas sank into one of the children's chairs, his legs suddenly unsteady. January 15th, just 3 days after Jacob's funeral, when the world had seemed like a dark, hostile place, and Thomas had wandered from town to town like a man sleepwalking through a nightmare. "I was there," he said quietly, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "In Cedar Falls, I mean. I remember stopping there, but Thomas," he pressed his palms against his temples, trying to force his memory to cooperate. "Everything from those first weeks is fuzzy. I was drinking too much, sleeping rough. Most days I couldn't tell you what town I was in or how I'd gotten there." Ada reached for his hand, her fingers warm and steady against his cold skin. "That doesn't mean anything. Grief affects people differently. The fact that you were in town doesn't make you a criminal." "I know that, Miss Ada," Crawford said gently, "but I need to know more specifics. Thomas, do you remember where you were staying? Anyone you might have talked to who could verify your whereabouts during the day?" Thomas closed his eyes, trying to piece together the fragments of memory from that terrible time. "I camped outside town. Didn't want to be around people, couldn't stand the thought of making conversation or pretending everything was normal. I remember buying supplies at the general store, maybe some whiskey, but I couldn't tell you what time of day it was or who served me." "The robbery happened around 2 in the afternoon, Crawford said. "Right in broad daylight, bold as brass. The robber shot the clerk when he tried to sound the alarm, then rode out of town heading west." "West toward where?" Ada asked. "Toward here, eventually. Toward Willow Ridge." Crawford folded the telegram carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I'm sorry, Thomas, but I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. Just for questioning, you understand. But Marshal Jenkins wants to talk to you personally, and I can't ignore a direct request from a federal marshal." The room seemed to tilt around Thomas, the familiar warmth and safety of the schoolhouse suddenly feeling like a trap. Everything he'd begun to build here, friendship with Crawford, his place in the community, his growing love for Ada, all of it, threatened to crumble because he'd been too lost in grief to pay attention to where he was or what was happening around him. "You can't seriously believe Thomas is capable of armed robbery," Ada said, her voice rising with each word. "He's the gentlest man I've ever known. He rescued a kitten from a tree, for heaven's sake. He carved Christmas angels for children. Does that sound like someone who would shoot an innocent person for money?" "What I believe doesn't matter," Crawford said sadly. "What matters is what I can prove, and right now I can't prove Thomas wasn't there when that bank was robbed." Thomas stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "What happens now?" "You'll come with me to Cedar Falls. Marshal Jenkins will want to hear your account of events, maybe have the witness take a look at you. If your story checks out and there's no solid evidence against you, you'll be free to go. And if it doesn't?" Ada's voice was barely above a whisper. Crawford's silence was answer enough. Thomas walked to the window, looking out at the schoolyard where Ada's students were building snow forts and laughing with the carefree joy of childhood. Just this morning, he'd been planning to help them with their arithmetic lessons after lunch. Now he might never see them again. "I need to get my things," he said finally. "Thomas, no." Ada was beside him suddenly, her hand on his arm. "You don't have to go. Not yet. Surely there's time Toto find proof of your innocence, to locate someone who remembers seeing you." "Miss Ada, if I run now, it'll only make me look guilty." Thomas covered her hand with his own, memorizing the feel of her fingers against his skin. "I have to face this. If I'm innocent, and I am innocent, then the truth will come out. But what if it doesn't?" The question burst from Ada with desperate intensity. "What if they decide you're guilty regardless of the truth? What if I lose you just when I've found you?" Thomas turned to face her fully, seeing his own fear reflected in her brown eyes. "Then at least you'll know that I didn't run, that I didn't abandon you, or this town, or the life we were building together." Crawford cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we should go. The weather's supposed to turn bad again tonight, and I want to get you to Cedar Falls before the roads become impassable." As Thomas gathered his few belongings from the barn, his hands shook with more than cold. The silver locket with Jacob's photograph, the wooden horse he'd carved years ago, the small journal Ada had given him for Christmas, these things suddenly seemed precious beyond measure, tangible connections to the life he was about to lose. Ada stood in the barn doorway, wrapped in her heavy winter coat, tears frozen on her cheeks. "I'll write to you," she said, "every day if they'll let me, and I'll find a way to prove your innocence, Thomas. I promise you that." "Don't make promises you can't keep," Thomas said gently, though his heart swelled at her fierce loyalty. Just remember me kindly, if this goes badly." "It won't go badly. It can't." Ada stepped forward and kissed him then, her lips soft and warm against his cold mouth. It was their first kiss, and perhaps their last, and Thomas tried to memorize every detail, the taste of tears on her lips, the way she fit perfectly in his arms, the desperate hope and love that passed between them without words. When they finally broke apart, Crawford was waiting by his wagon, his expression carefully neutral. Thomas climbed up beside the sheriff, leaving Ada standing alone in the doorway of the barn, where they'd shared so many quiet mornings and peaceful evenings. As the wagon pulled away from the house, Thomas looked back once to see Ada watching from the porch, her hand pressed to her lips as if holding their kiss safely inside. Then the wagon rounded a bend in the road, and she was gone, and Thomas was left to face whatever judgment awaited him in Cedar Falls, with nothing but his own uncertain memories and the fading warmth of Ada's love to sustain him. The journey to Cedar Falls took 2 days through snow-clogged mountain passes, with Thomas and Sheriff Crawford spending the night at a way station that smelled of unwashed bodies and stale tobacco. Thomas lay awake on the narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and trying to piece together his fragmented memories of that terrible time after Jacob's death. He remembered the pain, sharp and constant as a broken bone. He remembered the whiskey, how it dulled the edges of grief just enough to make breathing possible. He remembered riding aimlessly from town to town, seeking some impossible escape from the weight of his loss. But the specific details, times, places, conversations remained frustratingly out of reach, lost in the fog of trauma and alcohol. Crawford had been quietly supportive during the journey, sharing his food and maintaining a respectful silence when Thomas retreated into his own troubled thoughts. But Thomas could see the worry in the sheriff's eyes, the growing realization that friendship and character references might not be enough to overcome circumstantial evidence. "Tell me about this Marshal Jenkins," Thomas said as they resumed their journey on the second day. Crawford guided his team around a fallen tree branch, his face thoughtful. Good man, mostly. Fair-minded, but he's got a job to do, and political pressure from above. The territorial governor's been making noise about law and order, especially after a string of bank robberies last year. Jenkins needs to show results. Meaning he needs someone to hang for this, guilty or not. Meaning he'll follow the evidence where it leads, but he won't look too hard for evidence that points away from a convenient suspect. Crawford's tone was carefully neutral, but Thomas caught the warning embedded in his words. They reached Cedar Falls as the sun was setting, the town's lights twinkling like fallen stars against the snow-covered landscape. It was larger than Willow Ridge, with a proper hotel and several saloons that leaked golden light and raucous laughter into the winter evening. Thomas tried to remember his previous visit, but the buildings remained stubbornly unfamiliar, as if he'd never seen them before. Marshal Jenkins turned out to be a compact man in his 50s with steel-grey hair and the kind of moustache that suggested military service. His office was Spartan but organized, every paper in its proper place and every surface free of dust. He greeted Crawford with professional courtesy and Thomas with the kind of neutral politeness reserved for suspects who hadn't yet been formally charged. "Mr. Raye," Jenkins said, settling behind his desk with Thomas's case files spread before him. "I appreciate you coming in voluntarily to answer questions. Shows good character, in my opinion. I want this cleared up as much as you do, Marshal. I've got a life to get back to." "Yes. Sheriff Crawford mentioned you've been staying in Willow Ridge. Found yourself some roots there, have you?" Thomas nodded, thinking of Ada's warm kitchen and the children's eager faces in the schoolhouse. "More than I expected to, yes, sir." Jenkins opened the file and began reading from what appeared to be a witness statement. January 15th, approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Harold Morrison, the bank clerk, was approached by a man matching your general description. The man demanded money from the vault and shot Morrison in the leg when he hesitated. Made off with nearly $1,500 and rode west out of town. "I never set foot in that bank," Thomas said firmly. "I bought supplies at the general store and camped outside town, but I never went near the bank." "Can anyone verify that? The store clerk, perhaps?" Thomas closed his eyes, straining to remember. "There was a young man behind the counter, maybe 20 years old with red hair, but I didn't give him my name, didn't have any real conversation. Just bought what I needed and left." Jenkins made a note in the margin of his file. "We'll check with him tomorrow. What about your campsite? Anyone see you there during the day?" "I picked a spot away from the main road for privacy, didn't want to be bothered with questions or conversation." Thomas realized how damaging his own words sounded, but he was committed to honesty. "I was grieving, Marshal. My son had just died, and I wasn't fit company for anyone." "Yes, Sheriff Crawford explained about your loss. I'm sorry for your trouble." Jenkins' tone softened slightly, but his eyes remained professionally skeptical. "The thing is, Mr. Raye, grief can make a man do things he wouldn't normally consider. Desperate acts, impulsive decisions. If you needed money for your son's burial, or if you were drinking and not thinking clearly." "I didn't rob that bank." Thomas's voice carried the quiet conviction of absolute truth. "I may not remember every detail of those days, but I remember who I am. I've never stolen so much as a penny in my life, and I've never raised a hand in anger against an innocent person." Jenkins studied him for a long moment, then turned to a fresh page in his notes. "Tell me about your background, Mr. Raye, where you've worked, who can vouch for your character." For the next hour, Thomas recounted his history, the ranches where he'd worked, the men who'd employed him, the simple life he'd built with Jacob, moving from job to job across the territory. Jenkins took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. "You've lived an honest life," the marshal concluded when Thomas finished. "That much is clear, but honest men sometimes do dishonest things when they're pushed to their limits." "Not this honest man," Thomas said quietly. Jenkins closed the file and leaned back in his chair. "Tomorrow, we'll have the witness take a look at you, see if he can make a positive identification. We'll also check your story about the general store and see if anyone else remembers seeing you in town that day. Until then, you'll be staying in our jail. Nothing personal, you understand. Just standard procedure." The cell was clean but spare, containing little more than a narrow cot and a wash basin. Thomas sat on the edge of the bunk, his hands clasped between his knees, and tried to make peace with the possibility that he might never see Ada again. The thought was almost unbearable, worse, in some ways, than losing Jacob, because Jacob's death had been an accident of fate, while this felt like a cruel joke played by an indifferent universe. He pulled out the small journal Ada had given him for Christmas, its leather cover worn smooth by his fingers over the past weeks. He'd been recording his thoughts and memories in it, trying to make sense of his grief and his growing feelings for Ada. Now it might serve as his final testament, a record of the man he'd tried to be during his brief time in Willow Ridge. Thomas began to write, his hand moving steadily across the page. "If anyone reads this, and I'm not here to explain myself, know that I never robbed that bank in Cedar Falls. I may have been lost in grief, may have made poor decisions in those dark days after Jacob died, but I never took money that wasn't mine or hurt an innocent person. The man they're looking for is someone else, someone who happened to resemble me and be in the same place at the same time. I want Ada Ellison to know that the weeks I spent in Willow Ridge were the happiest of my adult life. She gave me hope when I thought there was none left, showed me that love could bloom again even in soil watered with tears. If I never see her again, I'll carry the memory of her kindness and courage with me wherever I go." To the children in her classroom, who accepted a broken-down cowboy without question and made him feel useful again, you reminded me why the world is worth fighting for. Keep learning, keep growing, keep believing in the possibility of good. And to Sheriff Crawford, who treated me with respect and dignity even when duty required him to arrest me, thank you for showing me that honor still exists in this world. Thomas paused in his writing, listening to the sounds of the town settling into evening voices from the saloons, the clip-clop of horses on cobblestone, the distant whistle of a train. Somewhere out there was the real bank robber, probably spending the stolen money without a care for the innocent man whose life he'd destroyed. Somewhere closer was Ada, perhaps standing at her window and wondering if she'd ever see him again. He returned to the journal, determined to record everything he could remember about that crucial day in January. If his memory was too damaged by grief and alcohol to provide a clear alibi, perhaps the written record would reveal some detail that could save him a person he'd spoken to, a transaction he'd forgotten, anything that could place him somewhere other than the Cedar Falls Bank at 2 o'clock on January 15th. "I arrived in Cedar Falls on the morning of January 14th, he wrote, camped by the creek about a mile west of town. I remember the water was partially frozen, and I had to break ice to water my horse. The next morning, January 15th, I rode into town early, maybe around 8 or 9 o'clock. The sun was well up, and people were going about their morning business. Thomas closed his eyes, willing himself to remember more. The general store was busy. There was a woman buying fabric, and an older man complaining about the price of flour. The clerk was young, maybe 20, with red hair and freckles. I bought coffee, hardtack, and a bottle of whiskey, paid with coins from my vest pocket. After that, I rode back to my camp and spent the day alone. I was drinking, trying to numb the pain of losing Jacob. I may have slept for part of the afternoon, I don't remember clearly. When evening came, I broke camp and rode west, wanting to put more distance between myself and civilization. I never went to the bank. I never spoke to Harold Morrison. I never shot anyone. I am innocent of this crime, whatever the witness might believe he saw. Thomas set down his pen and stared at the words he'd written. They were true, every one of them, but truth and proof were not the same thing. Unless something changed dramatically, unless some new evidence emerged to clear his name, he would likely hang for a crime he didn't commit while the real robber went free. The irony was bitter. He'd spent weeks learning to live again, learning to hope and love and plan for the future, only to have it all snatched away by a case of mistaken identity. He thought of Ada, probably sitting in her kitchen at this very moment, perhaps writing a letter she'd never be able to send. He thought of the children who would wonder why Mr. Thomas had disappeared so suddenly. He thought of the life they'd almost had together, the quiet mornings, the shared meals, the possibility of growing old with someone who understood his heart. Outside his cell window, snow began to fall again, covering the town in a fresh blanket of white that would hide the tracks of whoever had really robbed the Cedar Falls bank. Thomas lay down on the narrow cot and tried to prepare himself for whatever tomorrow would bring, clinging to the fading hope that somewhere in his fragmented memories lay the key to his salvation. The hearing convened at 10 o'clock on a grey March morning in Willow Ridge's small church, the only building large enough to accommodate the crowd that had gathered. Judge Harrison, a stern-faced man in his 60s, with a reputation for fairness, had travelled from the county seat to preside over what had become the most significant legal proceeding in the town's history. Thomas sat at a makeshift defendant's table, flanked by Sheriff Crawford and Dr. Murphy, who had volunteered to speak on his behalf, despite having no legal training. Across the aisle, Marshal Jenkins represented the prosecution, his file of evidence spread neatly before him like an indictment of Thomas's character. But it was the crowd that drew Thomas's attention. Nearly every resident of Willow Ridge seemed to be present, their faces a mixture of curiosity, concern, and judgment. Mrs. Henderson sat in the front row, her expression suggesting she'd already reached her verdict. Behind her, the shopkeepers and farmers who comprised the town's backbone whispered among themselves, trying to reconcile the helpful handyman they'd come to know with the dangerous criminal they were told he might be. And there, in the third row, sat Ada with several of her students. She wore her best blue dress and held herself with quiet dignity, but Thomas could see the strain in her face, the sleepless nights etched in the shadows beneath her eyes. When their gazes met, she offered him a small, encouraging smile that somehow made him feel both stronger and more terrified than before. "This is an informal hearing," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying easily through the church's vaulted space, "to determine whether there is sufficient evidence to bind Thomas Raye over for trial on charges of armed robbery and assault. Mr. Raye, you have the right to legal representation, but I understand you've chosen to represent yourself with assistance from local citizens." "Yes, Your Honor," Thomas replied, rising briefly from his chair. "I believe the truth will speak for itself." Marshal Jenkins presented his case methodically, beginning with Harold Morrison's identification of Thomas as the bank robber. Morrison, still walking with a cane from his injury, pointed directly at Thomas and declared with absolute certainty that he was the man who had shot him and stolen the bank's money. "I'll never forget that face," Morrison said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had lived with fear and pain for weeks. "He's the one. I'd stake my life on it." Jenkins followed with the circumstantial evidence: Thomas's presence in Cedar Falls on the day of the robbery, his inability to provide a solid alibi, his admission that he'd been drinking heavily and camping alone, where no one could verify his whereabouts during the crucial hours. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jenkins concluded, "we have positive identification from the victim. We have the defendant in the right place at the right time, and we have no credible evidence placing him anywhere else. This is not a case of mistaken identity. This is a clear-cut matter of guilt and consequence." When it came time for Thomas's defense, Dr. Murphy rose first, his medical bag at his feet and his manner quietly authoritative. "Your Honor, I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and I've seen what grief can do to a man's mind and memory. Thomas Raye arrived in our town carrying a burden of sorrow that would have crushed a lesser man. He was confused, disoriented, and yes, he'd been drinking to dull the pain of losing his only son. But in all the months I've known him, I've never seen the slightest hint of violence or dishonesty." Dr. Murphy went on to describe Thomas's gentle care of injured animals, his patient work with the schoolchildren, his honest dealings with everyone in town. "This is not the behavior of a man capable of cold-blooded robbery and assault," he concluded. Sheriff Crawford spoke next, his testimony carrying the weight of professional law enforcement experience. "I've known criminals, Your Honor, real ones. They have a hardness about them, a willingness to hurt others for personal gain. Thomas Raye is the opposite of that. He's a man who fixes broken things, who helps children with their lessons, who carved a Christmas angel for people he barely knew. One by one, the townspeople who had come to know Thomas stood to offer their testimony. The blacksmith spoke of Thomas's honest work. The general store owner described his fair dealings and prompt payment for goods. Even some who had initially been suspicious of the stranger had come to respect his character. But it was the children who provided the most powerful testimony. Little Mary Catherine, no more than 8 years old, stood on a chair so she could be seen over the pews and held up a drawing she'd made. "I drew this picture of Mr. Thomas fixing our school," she said in her clear, piping voice. "He's always helping people. He wouldn't hurt nobody. I mean, anybody." Judge Harrison examined the drawing solemnly, noting the careful detail with which the child had depicted Thomas at work, his face kind and patient as he repaired a broken desk, while children watched admiringly. "This is very good work, young lady," the judge said gently. "Thank you for sharing it with us." As the children filed back to their seats, Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. These innocents saw him more clearly than any adult witness, saw past the accusations and fears to the simple truth of who he was. Their faith in him was both humbling and heartbreaking, especially knowing that he might never see them grow up if the verdict went against him. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess to consider the testimony, and Thomas found himself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. Ada managed to reach his side, her hand finding his in the crowd. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "I want you to know that I believe in you completely. We all do." Thomas squeezed her hand, trying to memorize the feel of her fingers against his palm. "Thank you for fighting for me, for believing when the evidence suggested you shouldn't." "The evidence doesn't know your heart," Ada replied simply. "I do." Judge Harrison had barely called the hearing back to order when Sheriff Crawford rose from his seat with an urgent expression. "Your Honor, if I may, I've received some new information that bears directly on this case." The judge frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Sheriff, this hearing has already begun. Any new evidence should have been presented during the appropriate phase of—" "Begging your pardon, Your Honor, but this evidence only came to my attention during the recess. A witness has just come forward with information that could clear Mr. Raye completely." A murmur ran through the crowd as all eyes turned toward the church doors, where a weathered man in his 40s stood hat in hand, looking nervous but determined. Thomas didn't recognize him, but something about the man's bearing suggested he was a rancher or farmer, someone accustomed to hard work and honest dealing. "State your name for the record," Judge Harrison said, gesturing for the man to approach. "William Cartwright, Your Honor. I run a small spread about 10 miles east of Cedar Falls." Cartwright's voice carried the flat twang of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. "I was there that day, January 15th, and I saw what really happened." Marshal Jenkins shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We've had no opportunity to examine this witness or verify his claims." "Sit down, Marshal," Harrison said curtly. "I'll decide what's regular in my courtroom. Mr. Cartwright, please continue." Cartwright looked around the packed church, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but resolved to speak his piece. "My boy was sick that day, running a high fever, and my wife sent me to town to fetch the doctor. I was riding hard, worried about the child, when I saw a man come running out of the bank." The silence in the church was complete now, every person hanging on Cartwright's words. "This man, he jumped on his horse and took off west, riding like the devil himself was chasing him. But here's the thing." Cartwright turned to look directly at Thomas. "It wasn't him. The man I saw was younger, maybe 30 years old, and he had a scar running down the left side of his face from his eye to his jaw. Deep scar, like from a knife or broken glass." Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Finally, someone who could place another man at the scene of the crime. "Are you certain of this identification?" Judge Harrison asked. "This was nearly 2 months ago, and you say you were worried about your sick child." "Your Honor, when you're a father, you notice every detail when your boy's life might be hanging in the balance. I remember that day clear as crystal, weather, the time, everything. And I remember that scarred face because I thought to myself, Here's a man who's seen some hard times. Marshal Jenkins stood again, his expression skeptical. Mr. Cartwright, if you witnessed a bank robbery, why didn't you report it at the time? Why are you only coming forward now? Cartwright's weathered face flushed with embarrassment. Because I was focused on getting the doctor for my boy, and by the time I got back to town with him, the excitement was all over. I heard there'd been a robbery, but I figured the law had everything well in hand. It wasn't until my wife heard talk at the general store about this man being accused, he nodded toward Thomas, that she made me realize I had to speak up. And your son? Dr. Murphy asked gently. Did he recover? Yes, sir, thanks to Doc Henderson getting there in time. Broke the fever that very night. Cartwright's voice softened with remembered relief. My wife says if I'd stayed quiet and let an innocent man hang, it would have been a sin on our whole family. Sheriff Crawford stood and pulled something from his coat pocket, a piece of torn cloth. Your Honor, I also have this. It was found snagged on the bank's front door after the robbery. The fabric doesn't match any of Mr. Raye's clothing, but it's consistent with the type of coat a working man might wear. Judge Harrison examined the cloth carefully, holding it up to the light, streaming through the church's stained glass windows. This is wool, dyed dark blue. Mr. Raye, what color coat were you wearing that day? Brown leather, Your Honor. Same one I'm wearing now. Thomas stood and removed his coat, holding it up for inspection. The difference in color and material was obvious to everyone in the church. Marshal Jenkins made one final attempt to salvage his case. Your Honor, this witness could be mistaken about the date or confused about what he saw. The identification of Mr. Morrison is compromised, Judge Harrison interrupted, by the testimony of a credible witness who saw someone else fleeing the scene. Morrison was injured and traumatized. It's entirely possible he's confused a man he saw later with the actual perpetrator. The judge turned to address the entire assembly, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. Based on the testimony I've heard today, particularly that of Mr. Brustow, Cartwright, I find insufficient evidence to bind Thomas Raye over for trial. The charges against him are hereby dismissed. The explosion of sound that followed cheers, applause, and Ada's sob of relief nearly drowned out Harrison's final words. Thomas felt his knees buckle with the sudden release of tension and found himself supported by Dr. Murphy's steady hands. Congratulations, Thomas, the doctor said quietly. Justice has been served today. But Thomas barely heard him. All his attention was focused on Ada, who was pushing through the crowd toward him, with tears streaming down her face and joy radiating from every line of her body. When she reached him, she threw her arms around his neck without caring who was watching, and Thomas held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair and feeling like a man who'd been granted an impossible reprieve from execution. It's over, she whispered against his ear. You're free. You're really free. We're free, Thomas corrected, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. We can finally start that life we've been planning. Around them, the citizens of Willow Ridge pressed close with congratulations and apologies, but Thomas and Ada only had eyes for each other. They had faced the worst that fate could throw at them and emerged with their love intact. Now, finally, they could look toward the future without the shadow of the past hanging over them. Spring came early to Willow Ridge that year, as if the earth itself was celebrating Thomas's vindication. By April, the snow had melted from all but the highest peaks, and Ada's garden was already showing the first tender shoots of new growth. Thomas worked the soil with Samuel's tools, preparing beds for vegetables and flowers, while Ada planned their wedding with the quiet efficiency that marked everything she did. The proposal had been simple and private, just the two of them sitting on Ada's porch on a warm evening in late March. Thomas had pulled the simple gold band from his pocketbook, with money earned from his carpentry work around town, and asked if she would do him the honor of becoming his wife. I thought you'd never ask, Ada had replied, with tears in her eyes and laughter in her voice. They'd set the date for the first Saturday in June, wanting to give the town time to prepare and the weather time to cooperate. Dr. Murphy would perform the ceremony, having been ordained years ago before he took up medicine, and Sheriff Crawford had offered to give Ada away in lieu of the father she'd lost years before. But first, Thomas had something important to do. On a bright morning in early May, he saddled Belle and rode out to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking town. Jacob's grave was marked by a simple wooden cross that Thomas had carved during the long winter months, the letters of his son's name burned deep into the weathered wood. Thomas knelt beside the grave and placed a single wild flower rose of the first to bloom that spring at the base of the cross. "I'm getting married, son," he said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "To a good woman who would have loved you like her own. I hope you'd approve." The wind stirred through the new grass, and Thomas chose to take it as Jacob's blessing. "I wish you could be there to see it. Wish you could walk me down that aisle and tell me what you think of my bride. But I know you're watching somehow, and I know you'd want me to be happy." Thomas touched the cross gently, his fingers tracing the familiar letters. "I'll never stop missing you, boy. But I'm learning to carry that love forward instead of letting it drag me down." He sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the town wake up below, smoke rising from chimneys, children walking to school, the normal rhythms of life continuing as they always had and always would. Finally, he rose and brushed the dirt from his knees. "I'll bring her to meet you soon," he promised, "and maybe someday there'll be other children to tell stories about their Uncle Jacob. Would you like that?" The wedding day dawned clear and warm, with just enough breeze to keep the heat from becoming oppressive. The church was decorated with Ada's roses and filled with nearly every resident of Willow Ridge. Mrs. Henderson, won over at last by Thomas's obvious devotion to Ada, had even contributed her finest tablecloth for the reception. Thomas stood at the altar in his best suit, the same one he'd worn to Jacob's funeral, but somehow it felt right to mark this new beginning with clothing that connected him to his son's memory. When the doors opened and Ada appeared in her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her mature figure but still beautiful in its simplicity, Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. She was radiant as she walked down the aisle, her arm linked with Sheriff Crawford's, her eyes fixed on Thomas's face with a love so clear and strong that it seemed to illuminate the entire church. When she reached the altar and Crawford placed her hand in Thomas's, the older man whispered, "Take good care of her, my friend." "I will," Thomas promised, meaning it with every fiber of his being. Dr. Murphy's ceremony was brief but heartfelt, focusing on the mature love that had brought Thomas and Ada together, not the desperate passion of youth, but the deeper connection of two souls who had known loss and found in each other the strength to hope again. "Do you, Thomas, take Ada to be your wife, to love and cherish her for whatever years God grants you together?" "I do." The words came easily, carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "Do you, Ada, take Thomas to be your husband, to stand beside him through whatever joys and sorrows may come?" "I do." Ada's voice was steady and sure, her hand warm in Thomas's. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. Thomas, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle and sweet, witnessed by a congregation that had learned to see past surface appearances to the true nature of the people they'd grown to love. When they broke apart, the church erupted in applause and cheers, and Thomas felt a happiness so complete that it seemed almost too much for one heart to hold. The reception was held in the schoolhouse, with tables laden with food contributed by every family in town. Children ran between the adults' legs, their laughter mixing with the music of a local fiddler and the warm conversations of friends celebrating a love that had triumphed over tragedy. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself standing outside the schoolhouse, watching his new wife dance with Dr. Murphy while the children clapped in time to the music. The scene was so perfect, so filled with joy and community and hope, that he had to pause to absorb it fully. "Second thoughts?" Sheriff Crawford asked, joining him in the doorway. "Just the opposite," Thomas replied. "I'm thinking about how strange life issue, the worst thing that ever happened to me, led to the best thing that ever happened to me. That's the way it works sometimes. Pain and joy all mixed up together until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Thomas and Ada walked home together as husband and wife. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the air was sweet with the scent of Ada's roses. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked as they settled onto their porch now officially. "Only that it took us so long to find each other," Ada replied, leaning against his shoulder with a contentment that seemed to radiate from her very bones. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow they would begin their married life in earnest. Thomas would continue his carpentry work while Ada taught her students, and together they would build something lasting and beautiful from the ashes of their separate griefs. But tonight it was enough simply to be together, two hearts that had found their way home at last.